Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing stories ever told in the Tennessee mountains. Tell us where you're watching from as we get into this dark story. This video is not real. It was made just for fun. Any similarities to real people, living or dead, are purely coincidental. The Appalachian mountains have always kept secrets in their misty air. Isolated communities built their lives far away from the eyes of the outside world, hidden among deep valleys and thick forests. In 1858, when America was still divided, there was a remote property in Tennessee where silence was more important than any spoken word. The Morrison family lived there, on a piece of land that was surrounded by dense forest for hectares. The sunlight barely reached the tops of the old trees. The main house was a sturdy, dark wooden building, with 2 stories that seemed to keep an eye on anyone who came near, like watchful eyes. Abandoned barns and smaller buildings surrounded it, creating a complex that looked like a small village that had been forgotten by time. The Morrisons didn't talk to the villages nearby very often. They only went there when they needed to trade goods or get supplies. They only came down from the mountains once in a while, and when they did, they brought animal hides, medicinal herbs, and an uncomfortable silence that made local merchants look away. Jonathan Morrison was the head of that small family. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had calloused hands from working all the time. He ran the estate with a firm hand and few words. Eleanor, his wife, was almost like a ghost. She was rarely seen outside the main house. They said she had been a lively woman when she was younger, but something in the mountains had taken the color from her face and the happiness from her eyes. When someone saw her on the estate's narrow paths, she barely looked up and quickly said hello before disappearing into the trees like a shadow. There were other people living on those lands besides the Morrisons. People who worked for hire came and went, but not many stayed for long. Even the strongest and most fearless men felt uneasy in that place. They talked about strange noises that echoed through the woods at night and feelings of being watched, even when they were by themselves. Some people said they had seen things moving quickly between the trees, but they disappeared when they tried to look closely. But what bothered them the most was the complete silence that fell over the property at night, as if nature itself was holding its breath for something bad to happen. The neighbors who lived miles down the valley told scary stories about the Morrison family. They talked about strange lights that could be seen through the windows of the main house in the early morning, muffled cries that the wind carried down the mountain, and visitors who climbed the dangerous road and were never seen coming down again. But these were just whispers. People talked about them in quiet voices in churches and markets, always looking over their shoulders as if they were afraid the mountains were listening. Something changed in those cursed lands in 1858. On a very cold autumn night, a lone traveler knocked on the Morrisons' door to get out of the storm. His name was Thomas Blackwell. He was a middle-aged man who moved between towns to work as a blacksmith and carpenter. He didn't have any family, lived off the road, carried his tools in a heavy backpack, and slept wherever he happened to be at night. The Morrisons' house seemed like a gift from God when the storm hit the Appalachian mountains and he was caught off guard. Jonathan Morrison opened the door a little bit and looked at the soaked stranger who was begging for help. There was a long pause, a moment frozen in time, when Thomas Blackwell's fate was in the balance. Then, almost against his will, Jonathan opened the door all the way and quickly waved for the traveler to come in. Southern hospitality required at least that, even in the strangest situations. The inside of the Morrison house was just as dark as the outside. Every room had heavy, dark wood furniture. Thomas couldn't see outside because of the thick curtains, and the air smelled strange, but he couldn't quite place it. There was mold, dried herbs, and something else in it that was organic and made his stomach turn a little. Eleanor served the hot soup without saying a word. Her movements were stiff and lacked any real warmth. Thomas tried to talk to her, to thank her for being so nice, to talk about the storm, but all he got were short, one-word answers. That night was only the beginning of a series of events that would turn the Morrison estate into a dark legend that people in the Tennessee mountains would whisper about for generations. Thomas Blackwell didn't know it, but when he walked through that door, he stepped into a web of secrets that were as old as the mountains themselves. Getting out of it would be much harder than just waiting for the storm to pass. The storm went on for 3 whole days over the Appalachian Mountains. Thomas Blackwell stayed in the Morrison house, not only because of the storm that was raging in the area, but also because he felt that something was very wrong there. Jonathan would disappear into the depths of the property during the day and only come back at night with dirty clothes and a look that seemed to pierce through the walls. Eleanor moved around the house like a ghost, doing chores without thinking about them and only saying a few words when she needed to. The basement was what bothered Thomas the most. A heavy iron padlock kept the door to the house's depths locked, and every time he got close to that area he felt Jonathan's eyes on his back. There were noises coming from down there. The creaks could just be the old wood shifting, but in his mind they took on much more evil shapes. On the second night, Thomas woke up to a dull noise coming from the lower floor. Then he heard something heavy being dragged across the wooden floor. He carefully went down the stairs, avoiding the creaking steps. The only light he had was from a flickering candle he held in his hands. The main room was empty, but the door to the cellar was open, and a yellow light shone through the cracks. Thomas walked slowly, his heart pounding against his ribs, and looked through the small opening. What he saw made his blood run cold. Jonathan was down there, surrounded by shelves that ran along the stone walls. These shelves held vials, dozens of them, maybe even hundreds, filled with dark liquids and shapes that Thomas didn't want to look at more closely. But it wasn't just the bottles that bothered him. There were a lot of notebooks on a rough table, and each page was full of neat, tight writing. Jonathan was bent over one of these notebooks, taking notes with complete focus and not noticing anything else. Thomas quietly backed away, climbed the stairs with the same care, and lay down again on the small bed in the guest room. But that night, sleep didn't come back. He stayed awake until dawn, staring at the wooden ceiling and planning how to get away as soon as the storm passed. The sky finally started to clear on the 4th day in the morning. The thick clouds broke up, and a weak sun tried to warm the wet ground. Thomas told them he was leaving at breakfast, thanking them for their hospitality in a voice that made it clear he was in a hurry. Jonathan just nodded, but Eleanor held on to his arm as he walked to the door, her thin, claw-like fingers digging into the sleeve of his shirt. It was the first time her eyes had met his since Thomas got there, and what he saw there shocked him more than anything else he had seen in that house. It wasn't exactly fear. It was resignation, a deep and unsettling acceptance of something that had to happen. Eleanor opened her mouth like she was going to say something, but then she stopped and let go of his arm and walked away without saying anything. Thomas didn't want to wait for anything else. He stepped over the threshold and started down the muddy path that wound down the mountain. With each step he took, he got farther away from that cursed house. But that wasn't the end of Thomas Blackwell's story. He got to the closest village 3 hours later, with mud up to his knees, and went straight to the sheriff's office. Walter Green, a mountain veteran who knew every family and property within miles, was the man who helped him. Thomas told everything he had seen and felt at the Morrison house during those days. The words came out in a nervous rush, tripping over each other as they tried to be heard. Walter Green listened without saying anything, and his face stayed blank the whole time. The sheriff sighed heavily and leaned back in his creaking wooden chair when Thomas finally finished, out of breath and shaking. He said that the Morrison family had come to those lands more than 20 years ago, and they were known for being reclusive and strange. There were always rumors about families who chose to live in such isolation, but there was never anything solid enough to warrant an investigation. Thomas said that there was something very wrong with that property, and that the jars in the cellar and the notebooks with detailed notes were proof of shady business. Walter Green said he would look into it, but his face showed that he thought Thomas's story was just another example of the long history of exaggerated stories about the Morrisons. There were a lot of stories and superstitions about the Appalachian Mountains. Lonely men often saw things that weren't there, especially after spending the night in a strange house during a storm. That same day, Thomas Blackwell left the village and headed west in search of work and a safe distance from the mountains. He would never go back to Tennessee, and the memories he took with him would haunt him in nightmares for the rest of his life. But what he said made Walter Green doubt himself. Over the next few months, new rumors around the Morrison property would feed that doubt and help it grow. The next few months brought a harsh winter to the mountains of Tennessee. The trails were covered in snow, which made the properties in the deep Appalachian valleys even more cut off from each other. If it was possible, the Morrison family became even more private. Jonathan stopped coming to the villages to trade goods, and the only sign that life still existed in those far-off places was the smoke coming from his chimney. Walter Green hadn't completely forgotten Thomas Blackwell's scary story, but he was too busy with winter chores to climb the mountain and check out a story that was probably just a figment of his imagination. There were land disputes to settle, missing animals to find, and the everyday problems of a community fighting the cold. The Morrison estate stayed in the back of his mind, bothering him but not so much that he needed to do something about it right away. Walter didn't go to see the person he had promised to see until the spring of 1859. Samuel Reed, a traveling merchant, had come through the village and said he was going to the Morrison estate to sell his goods. He sold everything from fabrics and tools to rare medicines and spices. He thought that this family, who lived in such a remote area, would need supplies after a long winter. Walter tried to talk him out of it by suggesting other properties that would be more open to his offer, but Samuel was stubborn and sure of his ability to convince them. 3 weeks later, Samuel Reed still hadn't come back. Walter Green's wife came to see him. Her eyes were swollen with worry as she told him that her husband always sent messages while he was away, but this time there was no communication at all. She knew he was going to the Morrisons and that this was the last stop on his way home. Walter's stomach felt heavy, and Thomas Blackwell's words echoed in his mind like a bad sign. He got 2 of his most trusted friends, both of whom were good at finding their way around in the mountains and had hunting rifles, and they left on a foggy April morning. The hike to the Morrison property took almost 4 hours. The paths were muddy from melting snow, and the streams were full of icy water. The forest around them got thicker, and the silence got heavier as they climbed higher. There were no birds singing at that height, as if they were staying away from that part of the mountains. The Morrison house appeared out of the fog like a ghost. Heavy curtains covered the windows. There was no movement around the property, and everything felt still in an unnatural way. Walter Green knocked hard on the door, making it clear that he was there. There was a long silence, and then footsteps could be heard coming from the other side. The door creaked open, and Jonathan Morrison stepped out. He looked like he had aged decades since Walter last saw him. His eyes were deep-set and surrounded by dark shadows, and his skin was pale, which made his dark clothes stand out even more. Jonathan asked why they were there in a hoarse, tired voice that showed no surprise or friendliness. Walter said they were looking for Samuel Reed, the traveling merchant who had said he wanted to come to the property. Jonathan shook his head slowly and said that no merchants had ever come there, and that he hadn't seen anyone but his wife in months. Walter asked if he could look around the property to be sure. Jonathan hesitated, his fingers gripping the door so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he shrugged and waved his hand in a vague way, telling them they could look around. But his eyes held a silent warning, a hidden threat that didn't need words to be understood. The three men went their separate ways to look at the barns, the empty buildings, and the edges of the forest that surrounded the property. They didn't find anything right away. No clear sign of Samuel Reed or his unique wagon full of goods. But Joshua Miller, one of the men, saw something odd near one of the barns that was farther away. The ground there looked like it had been disturbed recently. The dirt was darker and looser than it should have been after weeks of rain and melting snow. With a worried look on his face, Joshua called Walter over and pointed to the spot. They started digging with shovels they found in the barn and didn't have to go very deep, less than half a meter below the surface. They found fabrics, the same kinds of fabrics that merchants like Samuel Reed used to carry. There were tools, small medicine bottles, and then, wrapped in thick canvas, something that made the three men instinctively pull away. There were personal items, like a Bible with the name Samuel Reed carved into the leather cover, a pocket watch that still worked, and letters to his wife. But there was no sign of Samuel himself. Walter Green felt bile rise in his throat. He turned to look at the main house and saw Jonathan Morrison watching them from a window on the second floor. His still and threatening shape stood out against the dim light inside. They needed more help, more men, and probably people in charge who were higher up than the village sheriff. Walter knew he had found something much bigger and scarier than he could have ever imagined. The Morrison estate wasn't just home to strange people who kept to themselves. It was also the scene of something very disturbing that had been hidden in the mountains for too long. He waved to his friends, and the three of them started to back away from the trails, keeping their rifles ready and their eyes on the house that watched them like a living, evil thing. The trip down the mountain was stressful and quick. Walter Green and his friends almost ran along the muddy paths, always looking back to see if Jonathan Morrison was coming out of the trees with unclear plans. But no one followed them, and the property stayed quiet behind them, hidden in its mist and its secrets that can't be spoken. When Walter got to the village, he quickly got a bigger group of men together and told them what they had found buried near the barn. Word got out quickly in homes and businesses, and within a few hours, a crowd had formed. Some wanted justice right away, while others were just interested in the Morrison family's long-standing secrets. Walter knew he had to be careful. If an angry mob climbed that mountain, there could be violence and evidence that could help explain what was really going on in those remote areas. He sent a messenger to the closest town to ask for the presence of higher-ups and official witnesses. At the same time, he set up a watch around the trails that led to the Morrison property to make sure that no one could get down without being seen. If Jonathan tried to run away, someone would stop him before he got to safety. The wait was torture. Each hour felt like it was stuck in the heavy air of fear and anticipation. 2 days later, officials from nearby counties came. They were used to dealing with land disputes and minor crimes, but they were clearly not ready for what they might find in the Appalachian Mountains. Walter took the bigger group back to the Morrison estate, this time with almost 20 armed and determined men. Everyone was quiet as they walked up the mountain, lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead at the top. The Morrison house looked just like it did when they left, still and empty. This time, though, there was no answer when they knocked on the door. Walter yelled out his name and told Jonathan to open the door right away. After that, there was complete silence, except for the sound of the wind whistling through the old trees. Walter told them to break in after they had been waiting for a few minutes. The door opened easily, showing the dark inside of the house. The strange smell that Thomas Blackwell had talked about months before was stronger now. It was a mix of dried herbs, dampness, and something organic that made the eyes water. The men carefully walked in, spreading out through the rooms on the ground floor with their rifles aimed at every shadow and dark corner. The main room was empty. The kitchen was empty with dirty dishes piled up in the sink, and it felt like life had suddenly stopped, as if the people who lived there had just disappeared into thin air. Joshua Miller was the one who found the basement door, which was still locked with the same heavy iron padlock. They used a lever to break the lock, and the metal broke with a loud crack that echoed through the empty house. The stairs down to the depths were steep and narrow, and the darkness below seemed almost solid, blocking the light from the lanterns the men were carrying. Walter went down first, and each step creaked under his weight. His heart raced with fear and determination. The basement looked just like Thomas had said it would, but it was even more disturbing when I was ready for the worst. There were shelves all over the stone walls, and the jars on them held preserved specimens that Walter didn't want to look at too closely. There were definitely animals, but there were also other things that his mind wouldn't let him put into the right category. Notebooks were all over the old-fashioned table, with page after page of detailed diagrams, notes in small handwriting, and plans that seemed to mix medical knowledge with something much more mysterious. Walter flipped through one of the notebooks, his hands shaking a little. The notes talked about experiments, efforts to keep things alive and study them, and an obsessive search for ways to understand natural processes that went beyond any known morals. Jonathan Morrison wasn't just a strange hermit. He was doing things that civilized society had stopped doing hundreds of years ago, and he was alone in the mountains where no one could question or stop him. Jonathan and Eleanor were still nowhere to be found. There was no one in the house upstairs, and the basement didn't show where they were. The men split up again, this time looking for more than just the property itself. They looked through every barn, every empty building, and every patch of forest that was easy to get to. The hours dragged on. It was almost dark when one of the men yelled from a distance near the edge of the Morrison property, where it met the wild woods. They ran to the spot and found a small cabin that was almost hidden by the thick trees. It was covered in vines and moss that made it look like it was part of the trees. The door was open a little bit and moved a little bit in the wind. Walter went in first, and what he found there made everything that had happened in the last few days seem like a warm-up. Eleanor Morrison was sitting in a wooden chair with her hands in her lap and her eyes on something far away that no one else could see. She didn't blink, breathe, or do anything else that would show she was aware of the men. Next to her, on a makeshift table, were more notebooks. These had a different handwriting, one that was more delicate but just as obsessive. Eleanor also kept records of her own observations and notes about the experiments that took place on the property. But there was no sign of Jonathan, as if he had just disappeared into the forest and become one with the shadows that always surrounded that cursed place. Without putting up a fight, Eleanor Morrison was taken out of that hidden cabin. Her eyes were empty and her mouth was slightly open, showing how deeply she had given up. It was as if something inside her had been broken beyond repair long before that day. The men carefully led her down the mountain, not sure if she was an accomplice who knew about the terrible things that happened on the property, or just another victim of Jonathan Morrison's obsessions. They tried to get Eleanor to talk in the days that followed, but she stayed mostly quiet. She took food and water when it was offered, followed simple instructions, but when asked direct questions, she just stared blankly and sighed with fear. It was as if her mind had gone to a place that no one could get to, a safe place where the memories of those mountains couldn't get to her. The doctors in the area looked at her and decided that she was not a threat to herself or anyone else. She was just lost in a deep sadness that no medicine could help. The search for Jonathan Morrison, on the other hand, grew more intense. Groups of men searched every inch of the property and the nearby woods. They found narrow paths through the thick woods. Some of these paths led to hidden clearings where there were signs of recent activity, like campfires that had been put out and tools that had been left behind. But there was no sign of Jonathan. It was like he knew those mountains so well that he could move through them like a ghost, unseen and unreachable. The notebooks that were found in the basement and the cabin were carefully looked over. The notes showed that the person had been working alone for years, using knowledge they had learned from who knows where. They had a brilliant but very troubled mind. There were mentions of old texts, medical practices that modern society had called barbaric, and a philosophy that saw the human and animal body as nothing more than things to study, without caring about pain or dignity. Jonathan Morrison had made his own private world where the rules of society didn't apply, and his obsessive curiosity was the only thing that mattered. Weeks turned into months, and the village slowly began to deal with the strange things that had happened in the mountains. Widows came forward saying that their husbands had gone on trips years ago and never come back. Families talked about distant relatives who said they were going west, but after they passed through the area, their letters stopped coming. Each story made the sad weight that hung over the memory of the Morrison estate even heavier. Every testimony added another layer of horror to the story that was being made. Walter Green felt the weight of these revelations like stones on his shoulders. He didn't do anything when Thomas Blackwell first warned him, and he let months go by while more tragedies could have happened in those remote mountains. Guilt ate away at him, keeping him up at night and making him stare at the distant slopes all the time, waiting for Jonathan to show up out of nowhere, either to get revenge or to keep living as a ghost. The Tennessee mountains were very hot in the summer of 1859. The Morrison estate was officially taken over, and its belongings were listed. The jars in the cellar were broken, and the things inside them were never fully identified before they were buried in deep pits far away from any water source. The main house was locked and labeled as county property, but no one wanted to live there or claim it. No matter how much time or cleaning you did, there was a stain on that place that would never go away. Eleanor Morrison was moved to a bigger city where she could get constant care. For the next few years, she would live there as a quiet, sad person who spent her days sitting by windows and looking out at the world with eyes that seemed to see nothing at all. When she did talk, it was only in bits and pieces. Words about shadows in the trees, whispers in the wind, and a man who knew things that nature never meant to tell. They never found Jonathan Morrison. The Appalachian forest is huge and harsh. It has deep caves, dangerous canyons, and places so thick that sunlight never reaches the ground. He could be anywhere or nowhere at all. Some thought he had died in the mountains he loved so much, either by accident or because he was crazy. People whispered that he was still out there, living as a hermit in secret caves and continuing his creepy studies far away from the eyes of civilization. Itinerant traders stopped going to that part of the mountains altogether. The forest slowly took back the paths that led to the old Morrison estate. They were covered in thick plants and forgotten by everyone but those who couldn't forget the bad memories. The house stayed there for years, its windows empty like blind eyes and its wooden walls getting darker from the weather. Eventually, it became just another nameless ruin lost in the green vastness of the Appalachians. But the stories lived on, told around campfires on cold nights and in quiet conversations in smoky bars. People told and retold the stories from that dark year. Each telling added new information, sometimes blowing it out of proportion and other times downplaying it, depending on who was listening. The Morrison estate became a legend, a warning about the dangers of being too alone, and what happens when smart people go too far outside of the rules of society and morality. The years went by slowly in the Tennessee mountains, as they always did, not caring about the human dramas that were happening below their ancient trees. The village slowly got back to normal after the events of 1859, but there was always a shadow over conversations when people talked about the Morrison lands. Walter Green aged quickly after those days. His hair turned completely gray in just a few months, and deep lines appeared on his face like scars from battles that no one could see. In 1862, the war split the country into two bloody camps, and the village's worries turned to more immediate issues of survival and loyalty. The young men went off to fight in far-off wars, and the women had to do the hard work of running the farms. The old Morrison house was just another distant memory, pushed to the back of people's minds as they dealt with more recent and real tragedies. The first reports of sightings came out during this crazy time. Hunters who went into the most remote parts of the mountains came back with stories of seeing a lone figure in the distance, always at dusk or dawn, when the light plays tricks on the eyes and shadows play tricks on the mind. The description was always vague. A tall, bent-over man who moved through the trees in a way that seemed unnatural, disappearing before anyone could get close enough to identify him with a certainty. Some people said it was all in their heads, that the hard times of war made people see ghosts where there were only animals or light playing through the thick trees. Others, especially those who had been part of the search years before, felt a chill run down their spines when they heard these stories. Did Jonathan Morrison really live in the wild mountains for all those years? And if so, what had happened to him after living like a fugitive animal for so long, cut off from the isolation he had chosen before? One of these hunters, a man named Henry Walsh, swore he had found clear signs of human habitation in a deep cave, miles beyond where any sensible person would go. There were signs of old campfires, bones of animals arranged in strange ways, and carvings on the walls of the cave that looked like symbols or records of some kind. Henry didn't stay long enough to look into it more because he felt a strong sense of danger that made him want to leave that place as soon as possible. Eleanor Morrison heard these stories at her remote school. When a nurse casually brought up the rumors of sightings in the mountains, something changed in her empty eyes. Eleanor spoke more than just broken pieces for the first time in years. She said that Jonathan would never leave those lands. They were as much a part of him as he was a part of them. The mountains had taken him back completely, and now he belonged more to them than to people. Not because they were clear, but because she spoke them with such conviction. Her words made me uneasy. Eleanor seemed to think that her husband had somehow changed into something else, something that didn't need a home, society, or any civilized comfort. She talked about how he had always said that to really understand nature, you had to become a part of it, getting rid of the fake barrier between observer and observed. As all wars do, the war came to an end, leaving the land and its people with deep scars. The survivors went home, changed, and with memories of horrible things that made the old stories about the Morrison estate seem almost silly. Reconstruction used up all the energy and resources that were available, and the mountains were once again pushed to the back of people's minds. But in 1868, something happened that brought back old fears. A family of new settlers who didn't know much about the area's history moved in on a piece of land not too far from the old Morrison territory. They were workers from somewhere in the north who wanted to start over on cheaper land that had been less affected by war. For the first few months, everything went well, and they started to build a simple but honest life on the slopes of the Appalachians. Then the visits at night started. When they woke up, they would find that tools had been moved, supplies had been rearranged, and strange footprints had appeared around their house. They didn't take anything, but the fact that someone broke into their property was clear and very upsetting. William Crane, the head of the family, tried to stay awake at night to catch the intruder, but he always ended up falling asleep. In the morning, there were new signs that someone had been there during his failed vigil. Things got worse when William finally saw the person who had been coming to see him. He was hiding behind the barn late at night and was determined to stay awake no matter what. The full moon gave off enough light to see shadows and movement. That's when he saw a man coming out of the trees, moving cautiously like an animal, and walking slowly and carefully toward the house. William couldn't see the person's face well, but the way they stood and moved made him feel scared for no reason. The man didn't seem to fit in, not because he was in the wrong place, but because he didn't seem to fit into the category of things William thought were human. The way he moved, the way his shoulders were tilted, and the way his head turned as he looked around made him seem more like an animal than a person. William yelled, breaking the quiet of the night, and the figure stopped moving right away. For what felt like an eternity, the man and the intruder stared at each other across the distance and the dim light. Then, without seeming to be in a hurry, the figure turned and walked back into the woods, where it vanished among the trees as if it had never been there. William ran inside, locked all the doors and windows, and the next morning he went to the nearest village to ask about the history of those lands. People in the village were uncomfortable and exchanged glances when William Crane came to ask about the history of the lands he had bought. No one wanted to be the first to tell the scary stories that haunted that part of the mountain. But finally, a local veteran named Thomas Green, who had all white hair and was the nephew of the late Sheriff Walter, sat down with William at a tavern table and started to tell him about things that had happened almost 10 years before. William listened in silence that grew louder and louder as he learned more about Jonathan Morrison, the experiments in the basement, the strange disappearances, and the fact that the head of that cursed family had never been caught. William's stomach churned when Thomas finished his story and added the rumors that Jonathan was still roaming the mountains and that people had seen him. The person he had seen the night before suddenly seemed much more dangerous, going from a simple thief or wanderer to something that could be much worse. Thomas told William to think about leaving the property for good and looking for land somewhere else, far away from the mountains where the shadows still hung. But William had put all of his savings into the property, brought his wife over, and started building buildings that would be important to his family's future. If you give up everything now, you'll lose money and your mind. He chose to stay, but he would do everything he could to keep his family safe. William strengthened all of his home's doors and windows, bought guns and ammo, and set up a surveillance system that he and his wife took turns using at night. Heavy latches and locks were put on every possible entry point, making the property look like a small fortress. He also got 2 big, aggressive hunting dogs that were trained to bark at anything that looked suspicious and protect their territory fiercely if they had to. There were no more problems for a few weeks. The nights went by without a hitch, and the dogs stayed calm. William started to think that maybe his show of strength and watchfulness had been enough to keep any intruder, whether it was Jonathan Morrison or some other unlucky person wandering through the mountains, away. The daily work on the land slowly took the place of the constant fear, and life started to feel tense but normal again. In October of that year, everything changed once more. William had gone to the village to buy supplies and sell some of his crops. The trip would take all day because of the distances. William's wife, Margaret, stayed on the property by herself with only the 2 dogs and the guns that William had left loaded and easy to get to. She spent the morning doing chores around the house, like sewing clothes that needed mending and making preserves for the winter. At noon, the dogs started to act up. They would go to the door and back, growling softly, with their ears up and alert to something Margaret couldn't quite make out. She looked carefully at the windows and the trees and the area around the property, but she didn't see anything strange. The day was clear and sunny, and everything seemed normal on the surface. But there was something in the air that made her uneasy, as if the atmosphere were heavy with expectation. One of the dogs started barking angrily at the barn in the afternoon. Margaret took one of the guns, made sure it was loaded, and carefully left the house, keeping her back against the wall as she walked towards the noise that was making the animal upset. The barn door was partly open, even though she was sure she had locked it that morning. As she got closer, her heart raced, and she held the rifle tightly between her sweaty hands. She kicked the door open wide and kept the gun pointed into the dark barn. Sunlight came in at an angle through the cracks in the boards, making patterns of light and shadow that made it hard for her to see. Margaret yelled loudly that she was armed and would shoot anyone who came into her house without thinking. Her voice sounded stronger than she really was. She was putting on a show of strength to hide the fear that was about to paralyze her. There was no answer, just the heavy silence and the sound of the wind whistling through the wooden buildings. Margaret slowly walked into the barn, and her eyes slowly got used to the low light. The tools were where they were supposed to be, and the supplies were stacked the way she had left them. But then she saw something that made her blood run cold. There were symbols scratched into the darker, older wood on the back wall. These were deliberate marks that made patterns she didn't know. It was clear that they were new because the wood that was scratched was lighter in color. Someone had been inside her barn and left these strange marks as some kind of message that she couldn't understand. Margaret quickly turned around and ran back into the house, locking the door behind her with the dogs, who now looked just as scared as she did. She spent the rest of the afternoon and early evening anxiously waiting for William to come back. She kept her rifle close by and her eyes on the windows, which showed how dark it was getting outside. When William got back at night, he could see that Margaret was upset. She told him about the symbols in the barn, and they looked at them together with a flashlight. When William saw the patterns, he felt a chill run down his spine. They weren't random. There was a clear reason for how they were put together, but the meaning was still unclear and disturbing. He made up his mind to go back to the village in the morning and show Thomas Green and other longtime residents drawings of these symbols. He hoped that someone would be able to identify them or at least give him some background information. William and Margaret had never had a night that long before. They took turns keeping watch, but even when one of them was sleeping, it wasn't deep and was full of broken nightmares. The dogs stayed restless all night, growling at the shadows outside the windows but never barking fully, as if they knew that making too much noise might draw unwanted attention from something best left alone. William went outside to look at the property in the light of day when dawn finally started to brighten the sky. He found something that made him feel sick. There were footprints all over the house, clear marks in the wet ground from morning dew, all the way around the building, as if someone had spent hours walking in circles around where they slept. The footprints were bare, and the toes were easy to see in the impressions. However, the proportions, spacing, and weight distribution didn't seem right. William followed the footprints until they led to the trees. There, at the edge of the forest, he saw more symbols scratched into the bark of different trees, always at eye level. They made a pattern that repeated itself with small changes. It was like someone was trying to say something to William in a language he didn't understand. They left messages that were clear in their intention to be noticed, but completely unclear in their real meaning. He went home, helped Margaret make a quick breakfast, and then left for the village right away. This time, he brought with him not only drawings of the symbols, but also a piece of tree bark with the symbols carved into it, proof that couldn't be easily dismissed as imagination or exaggeration. William rode his horse as fast as it could go to the village, driven by a growing sense of urgency to find answers, or at least some kind of action that would keep his family safe from whatever was happening on their property. Thomas Green looked at the symbols with a face that got more and more serious. He called other people who had lived there for a long time, and they all looked at the markings from every angle and in every light. One of the older men, who had been part of the original search of the Morrison property years before, recognized the symbols from one of the notebooks that were found in Jonathan's basement. They were part of the notation system he had made up, which included a mix of scientific symbols, personal notes, and something more basic that seemed to come from traditions that were much older than modern science. The fact that the symbols were definitely linked to Jonathan Morrison changed the situation from scary to possibly dangerous. It was no longer just a random person or an overactive mind. There was clear proof that Jonathan, or someone who worked closely with him, was actively marking the area around William's property and sending a message through a code that only he understood. The people in the village talked a lot about what should be done. Some people said it was time to put together a huge search of the mountains, getting enough men to search every cave and valley until they found Jonathan Morrison and put an end to the threat he posed once and for all. Some people were more careful and remembered that they had tried this years ago and failed. They also thought that going after a man who knew those mountains better than anyone else could lead to people getting lost or hurt in the dangerous terrain. Thomas Green came up with a different answer. He told William and Margaret to move to the village for a short time and stay with local families while a group of armed guards set up camp on the Crane property. The plan was to have a constant and large presence that would make it hard for anyone to get close, while also keeping the family safe while a long-term plan was made. At first, William didn't want to leave his land, even for a short time, because it hurt his pride. But in the end, he put Margaret's safety ahead of his own discomfort. That night, William and Margaret packed up their most important things and went to the village, leaving behind the property they had started to turn into a home. 6 armed men went to the house to take it over, bringing enough supplies for several weeks of watching. They set up shifts for sentries so that at least 2 men were always awake and alert, with their rifles loaded and ready for anything. William's dogs stayed with them, adding another layer of protection against sneaky approaches. The first few days were stressful but not very eventful. During the day, the lookouts walked around the property a lot, getting to know every building, every trail, and every good place to see things. They discovered more symbols carved into trees far away, always on the edges of the property, as if they were marking some kind of boundary or territory. The symbols were spread out in a circle around the main house, with more of them at the places where the trails entered or left the property. At midnight on the 5th night of the watch, the dogs started to growl softly. The guards quickly told the others, and within minutes, everyone was awake and at the key windows, looking out into the dark where their flashlights couldn't reach. The moon was getting bigger, but it still didn't give off much light. The shadows of the trees made patterns that looked like they were moving even when there was nothing there. For almost an hour, nothing happened except for the dogs barking and the guards getting more and more tense. Then one of them pointed out a movement in the trees, something or someone moving between the trunks in a way that didn't seem natural. They turned on all the flashlights they had and pointed them in the direction of the movement. But when the light finally got there was nothing to see. Just trees moving slightly in the night breeze. Dawn revealed that new symbols had been carved into trees closer to the house during the night, despite the guards' constant watch. Some of these trees were less than 20 meters from the windows where the guards were standing. The boldness of the act was very upsetting. The person who did this had an incredible ability to move without being seen or heard. They knew those lands better than anyone else, almost as if they had some kind of supernatural power. The men worked to set up traps and alarms around the property over the next few days. They tied ropes with bells to key places and spread dry branches that would make noise if someone stepped on them. This made a whole network of simple but useful warnings. And it worked, at least in part. After setting up these systems, bells rang at 3 a.m. on the first night. Everyone woke up right away. The lookouts ran to where the noise was coming from, swinging their flashlights around and pointing their rifles into the darkness. They saw that the ropes had been cut very carefully, the bells had been silenced and placed on the ground, and more symbols had been carved into the tree closest to them. It was as if the person doing this was playing with them, showing complete superiority despite all the safety measures and planning. The guards became more and more angry and scared. They weren't used to feeling weak, especially when they were in their own territory, armed and many. But this made them always mentally behind, because they never knew when or where the intruder would show up. They were always reacting instead of acting, and they were always one step behind someone who seemed to know what they were going to do next. William and Margaret got regular updates on what was going on with their property in the village. Every new event made them feel even worse. Margaret started to seriously wonder if they should just give up everything and move to a different state, far away from the Tennessee mountains and their dark secrets. William, on the other hand, was torn between his stubborn desire not to be kicked off his own land and his growing understanding that they might be facing something they couldn't control. Thomas Green started to think about more extreme options. He said that maybe they would have to burn down the whole old Morrison property, getting rid of all the evidence of that cursed place in the hopes that this would cut off any ties Jonathan still had to the area. Some people suggested bringing in outside experts, people who know how to handle strange situations, but no one knew who these people would be or how to find them. The Crane property kept getting worse while these talks were going on. During their night shifts, the guards started to feel strange things, like being watched, even when no one was around. Whispers that seemed to come from all over the place at once, but that went away when they tried to focus on them. One of the men said he saw a figure standing still on the edge of the forest for almost an hour, just watching the house. Then, finally, it turned around and disappeared into the trees. These stories started to sound more and more like fantasy, and there was growing worry that the men's lack of sleep and constant stress were affecting their judgment. Thomas Green decided to switch out the watchmen, sending the old ones back to the village for a good night's sleep and bringing in new ones. But the new guards quickly started to see the same strange things, which ruled out the idea that it was just the first guard's tiredness or imagination. Some people in the community thought that Jonathan Morrison had somehow become something more than human while he was living in the mountains. They said that he had been changed by being alone and obsessed with something that made him switch between civilization and savagery. Others thought he was just a very good survivalist and stealthy person who used fear and superstition to make himself seem bigger than he really was. No matter what the reason was, the practical effect was the same. An invisible but constant presence was essentially besieging the Crane property, and there was no clear way out. Winter was coming quickly, and with it would come snow and cold that would make it even harder to stay alert and survive in the mountains for everyone involved. That year, 1868, winter came to the Tennessee mountains with an unusual amount of force. In November, the snow began to fall, covering the Appalachian slopes with a white blanket that made the area look both beautiful and scary. The trails became almost impossible, and it became harder and harder for the village and the Crane estate to talk to each other. They could only go back and forth when the weather was good and they really needed supplies. The lookouts who stayed on the property had to deal with more and more problems. The bitter cold made it necessary to keep fires going all the time, but doing so meant that anyone hiding in the forest's shadows could always see where they were and how alert they were. The snow that covered everything was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it made it impossible for anyone to get close without leaving visible tracks. On the other hand, the frozen landscape made every sound louder and more distorted, turning the natural breaking of branches under the weight of the snow into possible signs of a stealthy approach. One of those cold December nights was when the watchmen finally had a more direct encounter with the presence that haunted them. The moon was full, and the light from the snow made it look like a ghostly glow that turned the night into something like perpetual twilight. 3 men were on guard duty when they saw new footprints in the snow. They started at the edge of the trees and went straight to the house. What made these footprints so scary was that they just showed up out of nowhere, with no path leading to the forest. It was as if someone had appeared out of nowhere and started walking across the open land. The lookouts knew this couldn't be true. There had to be a logical reason. Maybe the wind had covered the previous footprints, or the person had used some trick to hide their first approach. But at that moment, in the moonlight and the biting cold, the scene was so strange that even the most logical men started to doubt what they were seeing. They yelled warnings and shot into the air to warn people. But the footprints just stopped halfway to the house and then turned around and went back the same way they came, disappearing again with no sign of being connected to the forest. In the morning, when the sun shone on them, they were able to look more closely at the footprints that were still in the snow. There was still something very wrong with them. The distance between the steps made it look like they were very long. The depth was uneven in ways that didn't make sense given how human weight should be spread out, and there were marks around the main impressions that looked like the person had been using branches or other tools to test the ground before each step. Daniel Foster, an experienced hunter and one of the lookouts, spent hours looking at the footprints, trying to figure out how they had made that pattern. He finally came to the conclusion that whoever made those marks had an incredible understanding of how to move through snowy areas without leaving obvious trails. They probably used improvised snowshoes that were strategically placed and removed, and they moved in ways that made it hard for people to figure out where they were going and what they wanted. The find was both comforting and scary. It was reassuring because it gave a technical explanation instead of a supernatural one. It was also unsettling because it showed a level of skill and planning that made it clear they were dealing with someone who was extremely good at surviving in the mountains. Someone who had spent years, maybe decades, perfecting techniques that let them move through any terrain and in any weather condition without being seen. William Crane was about to have a nervous breakdown in the village. He was restless and irritable because he kept hearing about what was going on his property and couldn't do anything useful in the winter. Margaret, on the other hand, had gone quiet and was lost in thought. She spent a lot of time just looking out the window of the house where they were staying, her mind clearly elsewhere, processing the trauma of having her home broken into and her future left up in the air. Thomas Green set up regular meetings with the lookouts who were able to come down from the mountain. He did this to gather information, look for patterns, and see if there were any weaknesses or predictable behaviors in the intruder that could be used. But Jonathan Morrison, if he was the one behind it, didn't seem to follow any clear patterns. His visits happened at different times and places, and he used different methods each time. When he was under pressure, he could completely disappear, which suggested that he had resources and hiding places that had never been found before. In January 1869, something unexpected happened that changed the situation. Eleanor Morrison died at the place where she had lived for the last few years. The nurses said that she was unusually agitated in her last days. She had been so quiet and withdrawn, but then she started talking all the time. She talked about the mountains, the shadows moving among the trees, and a man who had become part of the forest in ways that civilized people couldn't fully understand. Eleanor had asked for paper and ink in the last hours before she died. With shaking hands, she wrote a letter to her husband, but no one knew how or if that letter would ever reach him. The letter's contents were broken up and hard to read all at once, but it had directions to a certain place in the mountains, coordinates that were given in relation to natural landmarks she had learned about while living in those remote areas for years. Finally, the letter got to Thomas Green, who read it very carefully to see if the information it contained could finally help him find Jonathan Morrison's hiding place. The descriptions were poetic and vague. They talked about a cave protected by 3 rocks that looked like a guardian from the right angle, a stream that flowed against what looked like gravity because of an optical illusion caused by the slope of the mountain, and trees marked with symbols that only people who knew where to look could see. Some people in the community said that the letter was just the last ramblings of a mind broken by tragedy and loneliness, and that trying to follow its instructions would be a waste of time and energy in already bad weather. But some people saw it as a chance, maybe the only real clue they had gotten in years about where Jonathan was, and said that it was worth at least trying to find the landmarks described as soon as it was safe to travel again in the winter. While these talks were going on, things on the Crane property changed in a way that no one expected. The guards started to find gifts left near the house at night. They weren't threats or scary symbols. They were gifts, in a way. They were professionally hunted and cleaned animals, dried medicinal herbs tied in bundles, and even small tools that had been missing from barns for weeks and were now coming back, sometimes fixed or slightly better. The change in behavior was upsetting in ways that were completely new. It was as if the person doing it had decided to change their strategy, going from scaring people to trying to talk to them or do something else. The guards didn't know what to make of it. Was it a complicated trap to catch them off guard, a sign of regret or a real change of heart? Or was there some other logic at work that they just couldn't understand? Daniel Foster came up with a controversial idea. He suggested putting a note near one of the places where the offerings had been left. The note should be simple and to the point, asking about intentions and offering to talk instead of fight. A lot of the other watchmen and people in the community thought the idea was dangerous and maybe naive, but Thomas Green supported it. He said that nothing else had worked so far and that it might be time to try something new. The message was carefully written so that it didn't make any direct accusations. It made it clear that the nighttime activities were known and that both sides were open to talking peacefully if they were both interested. The guards tied it to a wooden post near the barn, where it was safe from the snow by a piece of tarp. Then they went back to a safe distance to see if anyone would respond. There was no change for 2 days. On the third day, the message was gone, and in its place was a piece of tree bark with symbols carved into it. These were the same symbols that had been seen around the property in the weeks before, but this time there was something new with them. There were attempts at letters that were poorly formed and clearly written by someone who had forgotten or never fully learned how to write. The guards had to work together to figure out what the letters meant. The words, when put together, made a message that was hard to understand, but clearly meant something. They talked about land, about lines that had been crossed, and about an unspoken agreement that had been broken when new people came to live on land that had been left empty for a reason. But they also had something in them that could be seen as a willingness to live together as long as certain rules were followed, even though these rules weren't fully spelled out in the broken message. The answer caused a lot of discussion in the community. William Crane was angry that he couldn't freely use his own property, but he was also relieved that there was finally some way to talk to each other that might lead to a peaceful solution. Margaret was more practical and said that if they could live with some limits on their nighttime movement and exploration of certain areas of the property in exchange for peace and safety, it might be a good deal, at least for now, until they could come up with a better plan. Thomas Green thought that the exchange of messages might lead to finding Jonathan Morrison through long negotiations. Every time they talked, they would learn more about how he moved, what he could do, and eventually what he couldn't do. It was a long-term plan that would take a lot of patience, but it seemed better than the direct confrontational methods that had failed over and over again in the past. Eventually, winter turned into spring, which brought with it the melting of the mountains and a sense of renewal that was strange because it was so different from the constant tension that hung over the Crane estate. During the cold months, the exchange of messages continued sporadically, each one revealing bits of a thought that seemed to go back and forth between being clear and something much more basic. A mind that had been alone for so long that the lines between civilization and savagery had become blurry and permeable. A lot of people in the community were surprised by the choice William and Margaret made. They decided to stay on their land, but they did it in a way that was very different from what they had planned. Instead of trying to take over all of those lands, they accepted that there were parts of the forest they would not explore and areas they would not touch. They set up invisible but respected boundaries that would let them live in peace with the presence that lived in the deepest shadows of the mountains. There was no clear agreement, but everyone understood it through their actions and reactions over the course of weeks. The symbols on the trees stayed as boundary markers, and William learned to read them like simple maps that showed him where he could work freely and where he should stay away from. As long as the unwritten rules were followed, the nightly offerings slowly stopped, and there was almost no interference. Thomas Green never stopped looking for Jonathan Morrison. He put together occasional trips based on the bits of information in Eleanor's letter and new sightings reported by travelers and hunters. But the Appalachian mountains were huge and harsh, keeping their secrets safe from even the most determined attempts. Each expedition came back empty-handed, finding only signs of human activity, but never the man himself. It was as if he had become part of the landscape, blending in with the ancient rocks and trees. Years went by, and the scary things that happened turned into stories that were told in more and more different ways. People in the area began to think of the Crane estate as a strange place where the people who lived there followed strange rules and respected parts of the forest that were never touched. Eventually, other settlers moved in nearby, and everyone quickly learned about the unwritten rules that governed that part of the mountains. William sometimes felt like someone was watching him while he worked in the fields or fixed fences near the agreed-upon boundaries. It wasn't threatening, but it was definitely watchful. He never looked back. He had learned that some things were better left in the background, acknowledged but not directly confronted. Margaret came to the same conclusion, finding peace in an acceptance that would have seemed impossible during those scary first few months. The original Morrison house, that dark building that had been the center of so many mysteries, slowly fell apart because it was old and not taken care of. The wood rotted, the roof fell in, and the forest slowly took it back. Vines and bushes grew through the broken windows and doors that had fallen down, until it was just another mound of dirt and plants that only people who knew where to look could see. A simple gravestone marked the grave of Eleanor Morrison in a small cemetery near the institution where she spent her last years. It did not mention the tragedies and mysteries that had shaped her life. The only people who went to the funeral were the nurses who had taken care of her and the pastor who led the service. He didn't know anything about her life and gave general blessings to a soul he hoped had found peace after suffering on earth. Thomas Green grew old with the burden of questions that were never fully answered. He kept all the notebooks and papers about the Morrison case and carefully put them together in a collection that he hoped would one day show him patterns or truths that he hadn't seen before in his current reading. But the more he looked at those records, the more sure he became that some stories just don't have good endings. Life often doesn't give us the clean closure we want. The Appalachian Mountains went on living forever, unaffected by the small dramas that were happening below their canopies. Hunters still sometimes saw strange things, like footprints that disappeared for no reason or sounds that didn't belong to any known animal. But these stories turned into local legends, told with knowing smiles and creative twists, and they didn't scare people as much as they used to. William and Margaret Crane lived on that land for the rest of their lives. Their lives were different from what they had planned, but they found a strange kind of harmony in them. They learned that it is sometimes better to accept that some things will never be solved than to demand answers that may never come. They also learned that it is better to live with the unknown than to try to destroy it or be destroyed in the process. And deep in those old mountains, in caves that had never seen artificial light or in valleys that were so far away that no map had ever recorded them, there may still have been a presence strange and alone, living by rules that civilized people couldn't understand. Or maybe not. Maybe it was all just coincidences that were made worse by fear and imagination, or misunderstandings of perfectly normal things that were seen through the warped lenses of anxiety and superstition. If there is such a thing as truth in stories like this, it stayed hidden in the shadows of the Tennessee mountains, protected by trees that don't talk and rocks that don't judge. It waited patiently for a time that may never come, when it will be revealed or completely forgotten. The mountains are still there, silent and eternal, keeping their secrets safe with the patience of geological eras. They don't care about the generations that come and go, each bringing its own stories and leaving only bits of memories behind. If you've come this far with us on this trip through the shadows of Appalachia, think about subscribing to the channel for more stories that take you to the darkest parts of your mind. Let us know what you thought of this story by leaving a comment. Until the next one.